to take advantage of having a master translator with us here, and especially somebody who is trying to convey these foreign Buddhist ideas to a wider Western audience. Now, among academics, I'm familiar with academic work, and we often use technical terms to convey these ideas, or we use original terms in Sanskrit or Tibetan. So there's not as much challenge because the audience is almost always familiar with the idea. But then when you're doing translation for the general public, especially with that big linguistic and cultural gap between the East and the West, as you mentioned earlier, and to make such ideas accessible, I'm curious to know how you translate terms like Tathāgatagarbha or Gotra, terms that refer to Buddha nature, Dhātu, Tathāta, and so forth. So can you share a bit about the challenges you face and your preferences of translating these terms?
Yes, well, they are indeed a challenge, and it is, we're always stuck between the idea that, the Sanskrit or Tibetan term has so many connotations and such an atmosphere behind it and such a history behind it. It seems a shame in a way to try to attach some English word which may have very different set of associations for many people to a term. So the temptation is always to leave it in Sanskrit usually, because that would be the sort of most universal. But of course, if you leave too many words in Sanskrit, you begin to end up with a translation which is not really a translation at all. So it's a very difficult choice to make. I think there are certainly some words that are almost untranslatable. So for Tathāgatagarbha, for example, well, first of all, Tathāgata is so difficult, isn't it? Struggled with this a bit in the 84,000 work. We have very often ended up translating it as something rather unsatisfactory, like thus gone. And then, of course, that misses out the idea that it can also mean, thus come, or come from suchness and not gone to suchness. Similarly for sugata, well come or well gone. Which one is it? And what does well mean? What does suchness mean? So, in fact, in my draft translation, as it is so far, I've only half translated the words, and I've used, again, for garbha, I tended to translate it as essence, which is not very satisfactory. So I ended up saying something like, Tathāgata essence or Sugata essence. And it's very interesting in these texts, why do commentators or even the root text sometimes say Tathāgatagarbha? Why do they sometimes say Sugatagarbha? Why do they sometimes say Kam or Dhātu? Why do they sometimes talk about Gotra? And I think all of these words, which are essentially synonymous, it would be a great shame to translate them all as Buddha nature, because we would lose the specificity. And I think the range of different meanings is really important. So, as I said, I only half translate Tathāgatagarbha and Sugatagarbha, but come I tend to translate as something like a constituent. It's very interesting, isn't it, that Dhātu in Sanskrit has these two renderings in Tibetan. You have come and you have ying. So Chirki ying as the Dharma Dhātu, but otherwise, Dhātu often translates as come, some sort of element or constituent or something that is part of the constitution of something. And I think that is essentially the when kam is used in the Tibetan texts, that's essentially what it's talking about. Sugatagarbha and Tathāgatagarbha, there's a lot of discussion in the literature about garbha meaning an embryo or matrix or whatever it might be, but I think it's kind of simpler to stick to the Tibetan Nyingbo and think about it as being the sort of heart or essence of the Tathāgata or the Sugata nature. And then the most difficult is perhaps Gotra, which I think has a very significant meaning. Of course, Gotra in Sanskrit, Indian culture, there's this whole very important idea of lineage and clan, and what makes you what you are being to do with your ancestry, and but also it's not quite, there's this whole thing about Buddha nature. Is it something that we have in us, or is it, the danger is thinking of it as a thing. Is it a thing? Is it a nature? Or is it something to do with our origins or our destination? You know what I mean? And that's what's really interesting about even the title of the Ratnagotra Vibhaga, that it's the Uttara Tantra part, that it's a kind of continuity, and it represents something coming from a source and going to a destiny. And I think that's where the Gotra business fits in, that in the Indian idea of belonging to a clan, and I think of course Tibetan, we translate Rik, can translate so many different words in Sanskrit, meaning caste or family or whatever, but this is not Kula, it's not Varna, it's not some of those other words, it's actually Gotra, which is different. Some people translate it as potential, but I think that's okay for some interpretations, but it's a little bit weak, isn't it? If it just means, we will or can one day become enlightened, then it's not really saying much. It's not much of a Buddha nature. But I've actually tried to sort of think. I invented, well, not invented, but resurrected an archaic English word, which is geniture, which isn't really used anymore, but most people sort of understand vaguely what it means, because it's related to all of these words like gene and so forth. But it really has been used in past centuries to mean, on the one hand, one's ancestry, who one's parents, grandparents, etc., and also who one's descendants are, who one's children are. So it's that kind of idea of the continuity over the generations of something. And that seems to me...
You said geniture is the term.
Geniture, yes. But it's one of those words, when you're a translator, you get these, after thinking for ages and weeks and months about a particular term, you come up with some idea that you think is brilliant, but nobody else ever will. Nobody will ever adopt it. And you feel very enthusiastic about it for a while, and you see how people's faces are very flat when you explain it to them, and that it's just not going to work. So I don't know what I'll end up using, but disposition is another word. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, not at all. Sorry to interrupt you. So no. I've also been doing some translation, but I would truly consider myself an imposter translator, because a true translator is someone who translates into one's own native language, and you are the one who does that. And I think sometimes we don't get all the connotations an English word can have. So, for instance, if we did use word like potential for Gotra or Rik, it's already giving a specific connotation that will probably restrict the understanding of a full-blown Buddha in us. No?
Yes,
just shows the potential. Yeah. I think in our project, at least the Chadra project on Buddha nature, we are perhaps oversimplifying the complex topic of Tathāgatagarbha, but we have been consistently using the English term Buddha nature because it's very easy to convey the sort of general understanding, and I think it must have originated from the Chinese term forjing and rendered into Tibetan sometimes as Sangegi Rangshin. It's much easier to even translate compared to Tathāgatagarbha or Gotra. or Dhātu. Even Gotra, I actually want to ask you, one of the things that I have been doing, at least the term that I've been using, was gene, and then putting an adjective before that as spiritual gene. And your geniture, I was actually quite comforted to hear that. I wanted to ask you if it's totally off the point that Gotra should refer to call it a spiritual gene, because especially with our modern audience, even here in Bhutan, people can easily sort of strike a chord and understand the term gene as something that is like your Gotra, your rig. So instead of making sure that it's spiritual, not a physical clan or family line.
Yes,
So
I quite like spiritual gene, and I've heard it used. The problem for me, perhaps I'm being a little bit too hair splitting, is that a gene in physiology is only a tiny component of what makes us what we are. You know, you need thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of genes to produce a sort of complete being. So it's a bit too small, you know, whereas Gotra somehow means, you know, almost the whole person, the whole character of the person that's kind of carried by that thing, you know, by that heritage is another sort of word that's almost used, but heritage only goes backwards into the past, if you see what I mean. It's not really something that can carry into the future, which of course is another essential part of what the word means. So I think gene is on the right track. One would almost say, you know, but again, it would be anachronistically scientific. One could almost say, you know, DNA as a whole would be a sort of spiritual DNA would be a good metaphor, but it's not really a translation, is it? That's the problem.
And some people also use the term disposition. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it has good qualities. You know, it's on the right track, but again, it's just a little bit too weak. You know, you just have a disposition, you just have an inclination, you just have a sort of tendency towards. You know, and that, I think that's the trouble with those terms like disposition and potential. They're great, but not perhaps for some interpretations. I would think that, you know, for example, Mipam says at one point a sentence which I can't quote it unfortunately in Tibetan right now, but something like, you know, if one thinks that, I think he's actually criticizing some past scholars for thinking that Gotra only means the potential to attain Buddhahood. And if that's all that it means, then they're missing the point, sort of thing. So if you translate it as potential, then you say, you know, if you say that the potential only means the potential, you're missing the point. And of course, that doesn't really work. So I think, you know, but again, it depends on the interpretation. And I think on some perhaps Gelugpa and Sakyapa interpretations of the Gyulama, it works perfectly well.